Now, once we've got the management interface configured and we can access the firewall remotely for administration, another thing we could possibly take a look at is the basic settings of the firewall. In this case, I'm thinking about stuff such as DNS server addresses, time synchronization, maybe specifying and configuring the Palo Alto Networks, updates, and stuff like that is something that we will take a look at from the device and setup menu in most cases for most of those things. Let's go to device and setup and then start with management. We've got general settings that we can configure. In order to make changes here, just click on the tool icon, specify the host name for the firewall, like for example FW1, configure a domain. In my case, it is cybrac.com. You could also specify a login message, so when you connect to the firewall, when you log in, you will see the message displayed. This is also where we can specify some other settings, like the certificate related settings for the management network. This is where we can specify the time zone or set the time manually, and also enable some settings, additional settings, such as, for instance, the advanced routing mode. Okay, advanced routing mode is something that gives you access to more routing settings than the standard mode, and stuff like virtual routers and additional routing settings is what you will be able to look at when you turn the advanced routing mode on. But this is beyond the scope of this session. What I want to do at this point is just to configure the host name and the domain name. Maybe let's also change the time zone to something else. I'm gonna go for, let's go for New York here, and just okay for that. Okay, this is the basic stuff for general settings. Good thing to start your configuration. A bunch of additional settings you could consider would be additional banners or messages. And this is also where we can configure some other options related to the system behavior, like authentication settings, or to administration, like password complexity. We also have logging and reporting settings for monitoring, what we can specify. But in my case, it's pretty much the host name and then the domain name, what I wanted to configure here. Okay, another one that we have is DNS, NTP, and update server settings. So this time you want to switch from device setup management to device setup and operations. Excuse me, not operations, the services. We want to specify, edit the settings. Update server, I want to leave the default value. Once you've got DNS in place, the firewall is going to be able to perform the resolution, figure out the actual address to connect. I'm going to specify 8.8.8.8 for DNS, because my firewall will essentially use a DNS that is hosted by Google. I don't have any internal DNS server. You would normally have it. You would normally have probably an Active Directory, a domain Active Directory setup with DNS. In my case, I want to use external system. So there will be just one DNS configured on my firewall. What else? One more thing is going to be NTP server. I'm going to specify pool.ntp.org, which is another public service. So in this case, I don't have a internal NTP server, and I want to use external addresses, external, in this case, it's actually a cluster of NTP servers. NTP and DNS in this network will be configured as external services. You guys don't forget to subscribe if you like our content. Thanks! And the reason I configure these services as external, one of the reasons, is that I also want you to think about routing configuration, because the key thing to remember about PanOS is that by default, the firewall is always going to try to use the management interface to access external servers and external services. In order to change it, we will want to configure what is known as service routes. Just to make it clear, if we were to leave the configuration of those basic settings like that, with DNS configured as 8.8.8.8 and NTP server configured as an external service, the firewall would not be able to communicate with those servers in this network, because the management interface is what the firewall will eventually try to do to connect to them. And in my case, management network is a kind of like out of band. It is restricted. It is separated from the internet. It has no connection to the internet. So because of that, in order to get this setup work, we would also have to tell the firewall that for DNS and NTP, it should be using the Ethernet 1/2, an external interface for connectivity. So we want to force the firewall to use this interface for external services, specifically NTP and DNS. And the way we can accomplish this is with the aid of service routes. Service routes is something that we can configure from the same menu, device setup services, under services features, service route configuration. As you can tell, the management interface will be used by default for all those external services, which means that we want to click customize, and there is now two ways how we can define changes to this default configuration. One is going to be to specify the interface, source interface for this or another service. Like for instance, for DNS, I want to click on DNS and I want to change and select another interface. Ethernet 1/2 is still down, so I am not able to do so, but we will get back to this after we are done with firewall interfaces. For now, I just want to show you where to do the configuration. So we will also have to do the same for NTP. Tell it to access NTP servers, use a different interface. And the second way is going to be to go to the destination tab and specify the destination, like for example 8.8.8.8, and specify the interface from there. So the bottom line is that for service routes, you can configure them in one of two ways. You can either deploy them on a per external service basis or on a per destination basis.